and learning at MIT. Daniel's also an accomplished photographer. His recently published book, Portraits of Resilience, contains many moving portraits and stories of MIT community members who have overcome depression, anxiety, and trauma and other challenges. So overall, I would say Daniel's work is characterized by a deep and inspiring attention to elegance, beauty, and community. I'm really thrilled to have him speaking today. So please welcome Professor Daniel Jackson.
Well, thank you so much, Manu, for that incredibly generous, over-generous introduction. I think that if the students in my current software engineering class had heard your accolades, they would be astonished, having been rendered sleepless this entire term over their struggles with Node.js and other such things. I'm probably the most unpopular person in their lives. Anyway, it's a really great pleasure to be here today. I'm going to tell you about something I've been thinking about for a long time, which is essentially trying to figure out what the essence of software design is. I have to tell you up front, I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that question. However, I have a hypothesis. And my hope is that by sharing this hypothesis with you, this will be at least the start of a conversation that I'm very eager to have. So this actually began for me many years ago. I guess I've always actually been really interested in the question, just as a user of applications, what makes some applications wonderful and some horrible? And I've been pondering this question, even while my work has sometimes been more, in the weeds of formality and things like that. And something that for me was a sort of exemplary experience, or exemplary negative experience, and was something that happened to me frequently when my kids were in middle school. So it's hard to remember that this kind of thing would ever happen, before the days of Google Forms. But people actually used to send you forms that were on paper to sign. And a typical form we'd get was, something saying, our kids are going on a school outing, we're going to the touch and feel trip to the Nasty Co nuclear dump, and please, sign this form saying you understand that your child will be exposed to the normal kind of risks of childhood play and exposure to toxic waste and so on. And I would get this, invariably, the school would send this by email. They were very modern, and they'd ask this to be signed and returned. And so, of course, you sign it and you date it. And then the question is, how do you return this thing? Well, you could scan it, right, and then send it back by email. That seems even back in, 2009, that seemed kind of old-fashioned. So, of course, you go to something like Adobe Acrobat. And you're sure that you should be able to do the signing in Acrobat. And you look around and you see this bewildering array of toolbars and menus and so on, and you're really not sure what to do. And then it's at this point that I remember I've done this about 100 times. And I'm a pretty slow learner, and so I have a cache of about 300 or 400 files that remind me of how to do things in applications I don't remember how to do. And so it turns out I have a file that says how to add a signature in Acrobat, and all you need to do is go to Tools, Advanced Editing, and then you go Touch Up Object Tool, then you right-click in the document, you place the image, and you're done. Hey presto. Needless to say, this kind of thing did not endear me to Acrobat, and I don't think it endeared other people to Acrobat either. But, Adobe is hardly a poor company, and Adobe, has astonishingly wonderful products. And so this was puzzling to me. At the other end of the spectrum, there are things like Photoshop. It's sort of arguably its flagship product, that has completely dominated the world of photography. But Photoshop itself has some pretty weird things in it, too. Here's one example. Suppose you have an image, and you decide you're going to crop it. So in this case, I'm doing a pretty stupid crop. I'm going to put the crop box around the entire image. Well, you'd imagine that would do nothing, right? That it would only actually do something if you crop inside the image, but in fact, it does something bizarre to the image. And you're sort of wondering, how could that possibly happen? So Photoshop is a program with all kinds of weird things going on in it, and despite its huge power, it's also in some respects slightly unusable. And then on the other hand, there's Adobe's Lightroom product, perhaps it's much more recent, where they paid enormous attention to usability. And there, cropping does just exactly what you'd expect. You draw a marquee around some part of the image, and that's the stuff you get. And back years ago, I used to do this sort of ridiculous thing. I can't imagine any of you have done something so stupid, where I would, in a moment of mad frustration with Acrobat, I would type into Google, "I hate Acrobat." And sure enough, when I did that once, this site appeared, which gave you ratings of how many other people hated Acrobat. Sadly, this wonderful site appears not to have been so popular either and is gone. But fortunately, I took the screenshots, and it was wonderful. And I typed into it, "I love Lightroom," and sure enough, everyone else loved Lightroom too. And then there in the middle was Photoshop, which 70% of people loved and a bunch of people hated. Now, I'm not claiming this is a very reliable statistical survey, but I do actually believe that there's something fundamental going on here. That here's this company, Adobe, with extraordinary talent and a repertoire of amazing products, one of the best companies in the industry. But if you look at its products, some of them are surely not very usable, and some are spectacularly usable, and some are somewhere in the middle. So what could it be about these applications that puts them on the spectrum? And if we could somehow figure that out, could we design our products so they all look like Lightroom rather than looking like Acrobat? So what is the essence of the problem? Well, the first thing I should say is that I don't think it's anything to do with the user interface in the traditional sense. In all cases, these are professional user interfaces that are polished and well designed. However, if you look carefully at Acrobat in particular, you'll see that it's essentially a task-oriented design. And to be fair to Adobe, this no doubt happened because Acrobat became a kind of kitchen sink for everything you could do with PDF. So in some sense, it's just a very big collection of scripts. But the key point is that although it gives you access to all these tasks, there aren't really any underlying concepts. Now, Photoshop, on the other hand, has a bunch of formidable concepts that are really powerful and interesting. Unfortunately, many of its concepts are rather complicated. And I illustrated one of those examples with cropping. It actually turned out, in this version of Photoshop, and they fixed this later, that when you cropped, you actually cropped if you picked an aspect ratio, not to 2:3, for example, but to 2 inches by 3 inches. And you might wonder what that's about. Well, it's to do with the fact that the cropping tool also resized and resampled the image all in one. It wasn't actually possible to choose a dimensionless crop. And the result was that if you had the resolution set in a certain way, it resampled the image, and you could end up, getting a smaller image, as I illustrated. So the end of this story is a happy one, which is that Adobe actually fixed Acrobat. But interestingly, it took them 2 attempts. In the first attempt, in version 10, they produced a much nicer interface, but that interface still had all the same underlying conceptual problems. And if you look carefully, it's probably hard for you to see, you can see that they had a button for edit document text, and a button for edit object, and a button for edit text box. So objects, text boxes, and document paragraphs were all 3 different kinds of things that had no doubt sort of arisen historically. And eventually, in version 11, in 2012, they unified everything, and they finally got the idea of a sort of polymorphic object, which could be a text object or an image object, which behaves in exactly the way that you might imagine. So this got me thinking about these underlying concepts. And I came to believe that all applications essentially are characterized by their concepts. So if you were to explain to a Martian what Microsoft Word is, you would say Microsoft Word is paragraphs plus formats plus styles. If you had to explain what Twitter is, you might say, well, Twitter is tweets, hashtags, and following. And if you understand those 3 things, that's what you need to understand to get Twitter. And if you want to understand Photoshop, well, that's much harder. You need to understand things like layer masks. And I think there's something interesting here, which is that people have often resisted either learning or teaching these concepts. So a lot of books and tutorials on Photoshop will try and teach you how to remove red eye without telling you what a layer mask is, even though they're using a layer mask. And basically, it's hopeless. If you don't actually do the hard work to understand what layers and masks are, you'll never understand Photoshop. So I came to think that these concepts are really foundational for these applications. And it's not just for the applications, it's for application classes too. So the difference between a text editor and a word processor and a desktop publishing app isn't just that it gets more expensive from left to right. It's that they actually have different concepts. Text editors have things like lines in them, and buffers. Word processors have paragraphs, right? Paragraphs don't really exist as a concept in text editors. And desktop publishing apps have style sheets and text flow. Text flow is that ability to create empty text boxes and connect them together and then flow text through those boxes. And I was very amused by a post I saw a long time ago by someone who just upgraded Pages, and they said, I can't find linked text boxes anymore. Am I missing something? And they were missing something. What they'd missed was that Apple had actually downgraded Pages from a desktop publishing app to a word processor. And they didn't tell anybody that. And so all those poor professionals who were doing desktop publishing could suddenly no longer do it. Interestingly, Apple changed their mind, and Pages seems to be a desktop publishing app again. But this is quite fundamental. And in their list of 1,000 features that they added or took away from Pages, they never said, here's the big concept that's gone. So what are concepts? Well, the conceptual view, I Wikipedia'd this a few days ago, and it's really very confusing. If you look up concepts and conceptual models, it talks about mental models and problem domains and domain models and things like that. And I've thought about concepts and the role they play in these applications and come to the conclusion that although this might be very useful sort of for philosophy and maybe also for building databases, it's not a very helpful foundation for trying to understand the role that concepts play in these applications. So here are the respects in which I think concepts are something different. First of all, concepts aren't just out there to be identified. They're invented. Every concept was invented by someone. Even something we're deeply familiar with, like the concept of a social security number or a restaurant reservation. At some point, someone invented that idea. So in the case of styles in Microsoft Word, for example, I actually a long time ago did a little research on this. And I asked Charles Simone, because he had been the one essentially who designed Microsoft Word, and he said, well, I actually got styles from the Bravo text editor at Xerox PARC. So I went and asked his team at Xerox PARC, and they said, well, actually, in 1974, Tim Mott and Larry Tesler were working on it, and Tim Mott went and did an internship with a traditional printer called Gin Printing, actually in Boston, and found that they had this idea of style sheets. And he found a way to bring that concept of style sheets to the Xerox editor. So these ideas, even the ones we're deeply familiar with, were invented at some time and have in themselves often a long history. The second thing is that concepts are not included or excluded depending on some ontological examination of the problem domain. They're chosen because they actually fulfill some purpose. So here's an example, talking about styles again. Styles have existed in word processing programs like Word forever, as I said, since the 1970s. But slide presentation applications like PowerPoint and Keynote typically didn't have styles. And that was actually, I always thought, a real pain in the neck. It meant, for example, that the only mechanism you had for consistent formatting was the slide template, right, which is a different kind of concept. And so that allowed you to say, I want the top level point to be in 12 point and bold and whatever, and the second level point to be in 10 point and italic or whatever. But it didn't allow you to say, I'd like to have a special style called code. And so I always found when I was giving a talk that had code in it, I'd have to do something really kinky, like decide that code was going to be at the 4th level of indentation, because I didn't use that for anything else. And then I would struggle with the slide presentation app to make the 4th level of indentation not indented. And you could play all those kinds of games, but it never really worked. And then finally, the designers of Keynote decided, hey, we need paragraph styles. And in fact, and they introduced it, which was great. So concepts have a purpose. They have a cost as well, of course. Concept structure is something which I believe is not discovered, but designed. It's not something there out in the world. So in the case of styles, for example, the fundamental idea is that you have some collection of elements, in the case of a word processor, paragraphs. Then you have these styles, and the styles consist of rules that map properties to values, that the type size is 10 point or whatever. And of course, the essence of this structural design is that box style with two relations, right? One from elements and one to its properties. And that indirection is what gives style its power. It's what allows you to assign a style to multiple paragraphs, and then just by changing that one style, to have the styling of all the paragraphs change in one go. And as David Wheeler put it, there's no problem in computer science that cannot be solved by introducing another level of indirection. And I actually, when I was tracking down this quote a few years ago, because it's widely used, I had a nice email exchange with David Wheeler, and he confirmed that this was something he said. And one thing he said was that, he said, people always quote this part, but they never quote the other half of what I said, which was, and it always brings new problems. And that is indeed true. And style is just one example, and I'm going to give you an example in a moment of some problems that this indirection brings for style. Another feature of concepts is that concepts are reusable. If you invent a really good concept, you can use it in multiple contexts. And this happens not only with the familiar concepts in our life. Just think of reservations, right? It's not only restaurants that you can reserve. You can reserve taxis. You can reserve a million things. Well, similarly, the idea of styles is if you like, a kind of polymorphic concept. So PowerPoint color schemes are styles. And in fact, Keynote also has styles on images, which is very nice. So you can style images in consistent ways. Sometimes styles are sort of invisible, and you need to dig a little more deeply to understand that that's the concept that's going on. So my favorite example of that is swatches in InDesign. So InDesign has this little color palette where you can choose a color, and you can assign that color to an element in your drawing or your document. But the cool thing is that if you go and you change one of those swatches, so they're actually mutable, if you change one of them, then every object you previously colored with that swatch will get the new color. And that, of course, that's a little hard to understand if you've never seen it before, but if you've seen style in paragraph styling, for example, you say, oh, that's the style concept. I'm entirely familiar with that. Now, how do you actually explain these concepts to someone who doesn't understand them? So if I were going to explain style to someone who'd never seen it before, some poor person, for example, who's only ever produced documents in LaTeX, I can't imagine such a tragedy. Then you might explain it in the following way. You might say, well, here's how it works. If you assign a heading, for example, to 2 paragraphs, and then you change the style from bold to italic, then both of those paragraphs will be updated consistently. And that's cool because you only had to do it once, and obviously this extends to any number of paragraphs. Or I could put it more generically. I could say, if you create a style and you assign it to 2 elements, whatever those elements are, and you update the style, then all the elements change accordingly. So 2 things to notice. The first is that this explanation is not ontological. It's not a kind of dictionary definition that starts by saying a style is a mapping from A to B, right? These kinds of definitions, which somehow we gravitate towards in computer science, are incredibly unhelpful. And it's very bizarre to me that, in a computational discipline in which, all our most exciting examples are things that run and do stuff, we often find ourselves giving definitions in this kind of form. And even in daily life, this form of definition is by no means often always the most useful one. If you look at Johnson Laird's famous and enriching book on mental models, he talks about this. I think he uses the term constructive semantics to talk about explaining this kind of phenomenon. The other thing that's important to point out is that we might be tempted to say, as formalists, that if you had a complete specification of what styles did, you wouldn't need this kind of scenario. But I would argue that that's completely wrong. And the reason is, this is not redundant. Just because this is one example of a scenario, this is a motivating example that explains why this concept actually fulfills its purpose. Note that if I'd given you an example that said you apply the style to 1 paragraph or 1 element, then it wouldn't work anymore, right? It doesn't justify the existence of the concept. The whole justification is that I can apply it to multiple elements and then update them simultaneously. So there's something very powerful in an operational example that actually conveys the motivation for the design. And this idea is connected to Michael Polanyi's work, where he explains that if you had a complete definition of a clock, for example, so you knew the entire physics of how the clock worked, down to the quantum level, you would still not have a clue what was going on until someone actually explained to you that this clock was intended to measure time, right? And to tell you how this clock measured time. So there's this big gap between what Polanyi calls, the world of science and the world of engineering, for which he uses the term the logic of contrivances. Finally, I want to say something about concepts and what happens when they don't fulfill their purpose. This is something I've been thinking about for a while, and it really gets to our obsession with bugs and defects in software. So here's an example of a style dialog. I think this is from Microsoft Word, and this is a dialog that allows you to style a paragraph. And so you can choose the font and the font style and so on. Now notice that some of these entries are blank. That's very significant, because what it means is that you can define a partial style that sets only some properties. So maybe I want to allow myself to choose the font of my paragraphs, but I want the style, say, to make the font italic. And so in that way, I could apply this style to different paragraphs in different fonts, and they would all become italic. So it's very important for the working of this style that it be possible to do it in a partial way. But it actually turns out that although you can leave some of these fields blank, other of these fields cannot be left blank. The underline style, for example, cannot be blank. And so you cannot fail to override the underlining in a paragraph. So you might think this is nitpicky, but it actually turns out to be a significant functional limitation of this particular implementation, this concept. And I would call this not a bug, but to use Christopher Alexander's term, a misfit. It's not a bug because this implementation meets its specification, I'm sure. Some program manager at Microsoft, dictated how this should behave. Some coder built it, and it works, right? They've never seen fit to change it. But that doesn't mean that it does what you want it to do. And so we have to distinguish what I would call bugs, which are implementation failures, from misfits, which are design failures. And misfits are much harder because what they're really about, of course, is getting the specification wrong. And as Christopher Alexander points out, there's really no way that you can solve that problem perfectly, because there's an infinite number of possible requirements you might have to consider. And so the way you need to deal with that is essentially to use experience and patterns and things like that to be able to predict what kinds of purposes and variants of the purpose might be required. Finally, then, to summarize, I believe that concepts can be thought of as kind of modules of behavior for understanding software design at a behavioral level. And in contrast to the way the term is often used, I believe that concepts should be thought of as things that are inventive or invented. They're not just there for the taking. They're designed for a particular purpose. They should be understood behaviorally, not in terms of structure, although structure is an element of supporting their behavior. And they're self-contained and reusable. So in that sense, concepts are very different from many other implementation modules that we're familiar with, like abstract data types, which have some of these properties, but are certainly not self-contained. You can't use an abstract data type as a user. You need to have something else with it. They're reusable in a way, for example, that features are often not reusable. Features are often built on an underlying base of a particular application. So the way I think about specifying a concept is to give a name to it, its purpose, its structure, some actions that define its behavior, and then what I call the operational principle, which is that archetypal scenario. So for style, for example, the name would be style. The purpose is enabling consistent formatting. The structure is some relations, which I've shown textually there, and then some actions, creating a new style from a collection of property value pairs, deleting a style, assigning a style, modifying a style. And it's in designing these actions that you have to consider a lot of intricate questions, like what happens if I delete a style that's already associated with an existing element? And then the operational principle that basically says, why this is a good idea, that if you assign a style to two elements, you can update them simultaneously. So this is the idea of a concept. And over the last couple of years, I've been trying to build a research and teaching program around this idea of concepts. Most of my own personal work has been concerned with trying to figure out what the heck a concept is and to come up with some design rules, which I'm going to tell you about in the rest of the talk that would allow you to distinguish a good concept from a bad concept. We've been doing a whole bunch of design case studies. I've been looking just at lots of little applications. One of the delightful things about working in this area is that every time something drives you crazy and goes wrong, it's potential fodder for your research. So there's always a bright side. The most interesting case study that we've done has been done by my student, Santiago Perez de Rosso, who built a tool called Gitless, which is intended to be Git without the pain. And Gitless was based on a conceptual analysis using our ideas, and then a reworking to satisfy our design rules, and then basically a Pythonish veneer on top of Git's very powerful API. I'm working on a collection of design patterns because I think that's really essential to having reuse of design ideas. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit about some very exciting work that Santiago and a bevy of undergraduate and master's students have been working on to build a code platform around this idea to actually make this a modularity in the implementation sense as well. So let me show you 3 little design problems to motivate the design rules that I'd like to explain. So I'm going to show you these, and I'd like you to think as I show them to you to try and figure out what you think is wrong with this design. I'll be very interested to hear if you have different ideas about what the root cause of the problem is. And I should say before I show you these things, there's always a risk when you analyze a design carefully that you appear to be a little bit nitpicky. I can use the defense, Charles Eames, the furniture designer, famously said, the details are not details, the details are the design. And I certainly believe that to be the case. But I also want to point out that in every one of these cases, these nitpicks are not just philosophical ones. They actually produce real functional limitations. So having shown you the issue, I'm actually going to point to real things that actually prevent you from getting your work done due to the flaw in this particular concept. So the first one is in Gmail. So Gmail has this very helpful concept of categories. As I'm sure you all know, the idea is that it will automatically sort your incoming messages in your inbox into these different categories which get associated with different tabs to determine whether or not a message was related to some social media account, or maybe it was a promotion, which means someone's trying to sell you something, or it was spam or whatever. And there are various ways that you can configure this concept. You can choose which of these categories are going to appear, and you can assign them to tabs. So you have this nice ability to customize the appearance of your inbox. So you might have thought when this was introduced, people would just love this because it was providing new power they didn't have before. Prior to the introduction of categories, Gmail wasn't doing this automatic classification for you. So how did people actually react? Well, if you looked in the blogosphere, it wasn't exactly congratulatory. This feature was described as super confusing. Another writer said, Google gets it terribly, terribly wrong. It quickly became apparent that this new feature is a disaster. And as often happens, and this must be the most demoralizing thing for an application developer, one of the first things that came up if you Google categories was how to turn them off. Shortly afterwards, tech tip, how to make categories not happen. So the question is, why were people so annoyed? Well, I think the reason was they didn't understand what categories were. And in particular, they couldn't understand why categories were different from labels. Because Google already had this beautiful concept of label, which was a different concept from the concept of folder, which many other email clients were using, and had this great advantage that you could attach multiple labels to a message, essentially multiple axes of classification. And they also had what they call system labels. They had the idea that labels could be assigned automatically. So the question was, well, why didn't they just use labels and use system labels for these categories? So in researching this, I thought, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll go to Google's own web pages, and I'll read what they have to say about labels and categories, and see if that will reveal an understanding of what the difference is between the two. So I look up labels, and it says, using labels. Labels help you organize your messages into categories. Oh dear. So it seems that Google itself is a little confused about this. So what does this actually mean in practice? Well, it actually has some real ramifications. It means, for example, that you can't use this nice tabbing mechanism with labels, which is kind of sad. You can only use it for categories. You can't create new categories. Although you can create new labels, categories are more constrained than that. Also, by the way, it's kind of bizarre. A lot of people ended up with categories and labels with the same name, and that creates some bizarrities also. You also can't use tabs outside the inbox, and there doesn't seem to be any good reason for that, since you can apply labels ubiquitously across the product. So that's example number one. Example number two is on my favorite topic of photography. I have to say that one of the things that's been very interesting about looking for conceptual design flaws is coming to realize just how fantastic all the software is that we use day to day. And if you look at, I didn't want to sort of go to like really marginal software products that nobody ever seen before. So I always wanted to find nice examples from Google or Apple or Microsoft or Adobe or whatever. And the truth is, this software is pretty fantastic. And so it's quite hard, and you have to dig sometimes quite deeply to find something that hasn't been already dug out by their experience with millions of users. However, if you go to the world of consumer electronic devices, the situation, I think, is a little different, because a lot of the things that have happened in the Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft world hasn't quite hit the consumer electronics world yet. And although they build extraordinary products, their software culture is often not the same. So there's this amazing camera, the Fuji X100, which was an absolute huge success for Fuji, in part because they produced a camera that cost only about $1,500 and looked like a Leica. So everybody loved that. But it had some really cool features as well, which I'll tell you about that offline. I can talk for a long time about that, but I'll spare you. But let me tell you a little bit about the software. So if you look at the menus, there's a menu for image quality. This is already, by the way, a slightly bizarre thing. What this is really doing is allowing you to do two different things: to choose whether or not you want JPEGs to be recorded or RAWs to be recorded, or both, and to also set the quality level of the JPEG in terms of its compression. So you can choose, for example, fine plus RAW, which means I want the best JPEGs to be recorded with a RAW image. Now, one of the cool things that this camera does is that you can change the aspect ratio. So rather than seeing this image through the viewfinder, you could choose to see a square image instead. Excuse me. And you might think that's a small thing, because after all, can't you just crop post-process? Well, you can, but it's very different to see the original crop in the viewfinder. And here's how you do that in this camera. You go to a setting called image size, and you can switch from 3:2, for example, to 1:1. Now, you might notice here, you can see those LMS markings on the left. Those are a sort of clue that something a little fishy is going on here. But I can set it to 1:1, and now I will indeed get this nice crop. And so now I'm in a setting where I have the image quality set to fine plus RAW, and I have this aspect ratio set to 1:1. So now the question is, what if I want to only store RAW images and not have JPEGs? So I go and I change the image quality to RAW, and now, oops, the image size says RAW in gray, which means essentially, sorry, you can't do that aspect ratio thing with RAW images. So you might be saying, well, that makes sense, right? Because this is in-camera cropping. And in-camera cropping surely only works for JPEGs. That's not actually true. And if you actually look at the raw image that you get out of the camera in a program like Lightroom or Photoshop, you will see that it has superimposed a non-destructive crop in the metadata of the image. So the people who did the image processing did exactly the right thing. And they implemented this beautiful notion of cropping, but it's not available at the user interface level. And if you want to get this cropping of the RAW, you need to generate a JPEG and throw it away, which is very bizarre. And it's very surprising to me that Fuji hasn't fixed this. Maybe not enough people use the feature, who knows? So my final example, back to our old friend styles. So in InDesign, there's a window like this, for setting a character style. So let's suppose I want to choose emphasis. So I want to create a style for emphasizing things, and it's currently set to italic. So the question is, what other options might I have, right, if I don't want italic? So maybe I want to underline everything that's emphasized. So what do you think is going to happen if I click on that font style menu? What other options will I have? So you're probably all thinking, bold, italic, and so on. Well, these are the options that I get. So this is very unhappy indeed. What's actually happened is that InDesign has collected all the different font variants from all the fonts I have installed. And since I'm a little bit of a font freak, I've got a lot of fonts. And there they all are. But notice that there are things that actually are sort of italic-y that aren't called italic, like light italic. So the result of this is that you cannot actually define a style that italicizes, because it will only work on certain fonts that call their italic italic. If you, for example, if your main font is Arno, well, then you get lucky, because Arno's italic is called Arno italic. But if you are using Futura Book, unfortunately, Futura Book's italic is called oblique, so that won't work. Similarly, if you're using Magma Light, it turns out that Magma Light's italic is called light italic, right? So basically, this style setting doesn't work. It turns out Apple actually solved this problem way back in Keynote 2009. Actually, that shouldn't have been Keynote. That should have been Pages. And what you'll see is that they've actually marked the font as Magma Light. So they actually have a subtly different concept of font that takes into account the font variants. Sadly, because they wanted to simplify things, and I guess thought this dialogue was too complicated, or who knows why, when they upgraded, they undid this. And they went back a few years later in Keynote, in Pages 6, to the font being Magma again, and it's all broken all over again. So Apple is unfortunately no better than Adobe or anyone else. So here's what I think is going on. In Gmail, you have one purpose, namely classifying messages, but you have two concepts, label and category, and that's created problems. In the camera case, you have two different purposes and one concept. The two different purposes are setting the aspect ratio and choosing the image resolution, and those both got woven in to the concept of the image size. And you might have noticed that what you're really getting there is a Cartesian product, right, of the different resolution settings and the aspect ratios. So it was lucky for them that they only had 2 or 3 aspect ratios. And when people ask, endlessly online, I should say, why don't you also do 4:3? I know the answer to that question, because it's the Cartesian product, and that menu is going to get very, very bad. In the case of style, the InDesign style, essentially the problem is that there was a purpose, and the purpose was essentially to specify a font-independent styling, but there was no concept there of a kind of subfamily to support it. And so that leads me to this idea that I call the singularity rule, that what you should have is a one-to-one mapping between purposes and concepts. And I have to say, well, I can tell you two ways that this slightly reductionist and crazy idea came to mind. The first was in our experience with Gitless. We were trying to figure out what was going on in the different interactions between concepts in Git. And so Santiago and I were looking in particular at our old friend, the staging area, or the index it's sometimes called. And we were trying to understand why there were certain lacks of orthogonality between the staging area and other concepts in Git. And to do that, we thought it was something to do with maybe the specifications being violated by these non-orthogonal concepts and so on. And so we would go to people and we would say to them, we think the staging area has this purpose, but it doesn't seem to be meeting it in the following way. And they would always say to us, no, you've got it completely wrong. The staging area doesn't have that purpose at all. It has a completely different purpose. And so we discovered that people thought the staging area had about 10 purposes. And it finally dawned on us that that was the problem. That if you have a concept that's central to your application and nobody knows what it's for, or at least everybody thinks it's for something different, then you've probably screwed up and you're probably going to have trouble. So that led us to this rather naive idea that every concept should have a purpose and that should be a one-to-one mapping. The other thing I think was going on was that years ago I read this terrific book after meeting this mechanical engineering professor, Nam Su, who came up with this idea of what he called axiomatic design, which is a theory of mechanical engineering and for essentially designing devices that are sort of resilient to change. And the underlying idea in axiomatic design, well, one of his two axioms is essentially to have this bijection between functional specifications, what he calls design parameters. But it's essentially the same idea. So there are four ways that you can mess up with respect to this one-to-one mapping. You can obviously have a purpose that has no concept. You can have a concept that has no purpose. And I think we don't need to discuss those much more, right? It's pretty obvious that you don't want either of those things to happen. The two more controversial ones are that you can have a redundant concept, so that you have one purpose that's being delivered by two different concepts that are both there with the intention of satisfying that purpose independently. And as I've argued in the case of Gmail, that often leads to trouble. So I think that's actually a fairly straightforward one, and I won't say more about that. And then there's the one which I think is really interesting, and that's the claim that you shouldn't attempt to fulfill two purposes with a single concept. And this seems to be completely contrary to the way we think about engineering design. After all, if you think about the windshield in your car, you're quite happy, that it not only holds up the roof, but it also keeps the rain out. And you probably wouldn't want to have two separate components, maybe like, steel rods to hold the roof up, and, a rain shield to hold the rain out, and, another product to, to keep the warm air in, and so on. But I believe that software is somehow different, and I've come to the conclusion that in software we really have the opportunity, because we don't need to do what people sometimes call function sharing in physical design, we don't need to have one concept fulfill multiple purposes. And that if we can have one concept to each purpose, we can end up with a much more orthogonal and clean design. So the Fuji camera suffered from exactly this problem, and I call this piggybacking. And this is an inference for what I think probably happened, which was that someone said, let's add a cool aspect ratio feature. And someone else said, well, where are we going to put that? We've already got enough menus. And then someone said, well, we've got that image size menu, remember? And that gives these pixel dimensions to our image. And isn't aspect ratio just about pixel dimensions? They said, yeah, sure, it's sort of about pixel dimensions. So they said, throw it in there. So they threw it in there, piggybacking aspect ratio on top of JPEG dimensions. And of course, that led to this very unfortunate coupling of the aspect ratio with the JPEGs. Here's, I think, an even worse example. Epson's printer driver looks like this. If I click on paper size for my printer, here's what I get. I get a bunch of different paper size options, but there are submenus. So I can't actually just choose US letter. I need to choose something more specific. What's the more specific thing? Well, US letter manual front, US letter manual roll, and so on. In other words, what they've done is they've piggybacked onto the concept of the paper size, the feed source of the paper in the printer. And again, you can imagine why they did it. If they hadn't done this, they would have needed to extend the printer driver beyond the standard Apple printer driver. I'm pretty sure Apple has an API to do that, because I know that our Xerox printer at work uses that. But I can imagine that's quite a lot of work. And the designers of this Epson printer didn't want to do that. So they said, well, it will just fit in there fine with paper size, right? Well, sadly, it doesn't sit there fine, and it creates all kind of weirdnesses. Many applications, for example, want you to choose a paper size in the page setup. And having done that, that means that the document you've created will now only print from the paper source at the front of the printer. It also turns out that in some applications there are page presets. So in Lightroom, for example, you can design a nice layout for a photo with borders and maybe a title and whatever, and that now gets bound to the feed. So now if you try and apply that preset, but you want to feed the paper from the back instead of the front, you're hosed. So this is really very unfortunate. Here's a final example of this overloading, and it's a sort of mind-numbingly simple example, but I think in some ways it's quite revealing. If you think about the concept of a subject in an email message, which we might call more generally a précis, right? What is its purpose? Well, its purpose is very obvious, which is to summarize the content, so you don't need to read the whole message. But what actually happened over time was that, and this I believe happens to a lot of concepts, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, is that new purposes emerge. So one of the purposes that emerged for the subject concept was being able to indicate the target of the message. So even though there was a to field, listservs started to help people, to sort of remind them that this was a listserv message, started putting the name of the listserv into the subject field. And Sriram Krishnamurti pointed out to me that this actually has a nasty consequence, which is that he had a colleague who BCC'd a list of faculty members, hoping that they would not realize that the whole list had actually been included in the BCC. And of course, this causes the BCC to fail with respect to its purpose, because the listserv then puts the name of the listserv into the subject field. And another nice example of an overloading emerging over time was pointed out to me by my former student, Insuk Kang. He was making a lot of trip reservations with Expedia or Travelocity or one of those companies, and they were sending him emails that always had the subject header, your trip reservation. And unfortunately, Gmail was creating conversations based on the text in the subject line. And Gmail doesn't allow you to break up existing conversations. And so he wanted to classify conversations, according to, my splash trip, my FSE trip or whatever, but wasn't able to do that because these common subject fields were munging all the conversations together. Okay, so that's the idea of overloading, and I think that although there can be a good reason to overload a concept for multiple purposes, for a certain economy that might lead you not to want to introduce a new purpose, it almost always has liabilities. The second rule that I want to talk about, I call the uniformity rule, and I think this is, like many of these things, not a new idea, just a consolidation of ideas that have been out there for a long time. And the uniformity rule says that the operational principle should apply uniformly over the types, the states, and the arguments of the actions, and so on. So to give you a few examples, in spreadsheets, there is a concept of a range. And the concept of a range, the operational principle essentially is you can define a formula over a range of cells, and then if you change that range by inserting or deleting rows from the range, the formula will be appropriately updated. Right? So this is really nice. You don't actually have to specify all the individual elements, and this is why the range is not just short for an explicit set of references, right? Unfortunately, this operational principle doesn't quite work. It's not true that you can add a row, because you can't add a row after the end or before the beginning. And this actually turns out to be incredibly annoying. Just like the example I told you earlier about Apple and the fonts, someone at Apple figured this out. And in the old version of Apple Numbers, they had a beautiful solution to this, which was that when you placed your cursor in the range, so the selected cell was within the range, and you added a row, that new row was always within the range. So if you placed your cursor on the last cell in the range and you added a row below it, the range was extended. If you placed your cursor after the last row in the range, outside, and you added a row before it, the range was not extended. And this worked beautifully, and was a little bit of design knowledge that was lost when they produced the new version of Numbers. And it seems that Excel hasn't discovered this either, but it actually makes quite a significant difference in usability. A second example, I'm sure familiar to many of you, the concept of a group. So the operational principle says you select a collection of objects, you make them into a group, and then subsequently they can be treated as a single object. Except this also doesn't apply uniformly. It turns out that most slide presentation tools have a special category of slide template objects, like the main object that holds the points on a slide. And at least in Keynote, and I believe the same is true in PowerPoint, you cannot include that thing in a group. And that's kind of annoying. Another example from our favorite program, Git. So, there's a concept of a branch, and there's an operational principle that says if you want to start a new line of development, then all you have to do is create a branch or switch branches. Except that's also not uniform, because there are all these caveats. Well, you'd better be in a state in which you don't have any conflicts. And then it turns out there are all kinds of things you have to do, and if you fail to do those or are unable to do those, then there's another concept of stashing, which is a kind of band-aid to make up for the fact that you're in this horrible state you can't get out of. And one of the nice things that Santiago did in Gitless was to eliminate this non-uniformity in branching, so that at any point you can just say branch, whatever the state of your working directory in its relationship to the repo. Final example of this, in Dropbox. So Dropbox has this beautiful concept of a share, right, that we're all familiar with, except, and the operational principle basically says you can pick a folder and you can designate it as a shared folder to be accessed by your colleagues, and they can subsequently view or maybe edit the contents of that folder. Except, again, there's a caveat, and the caveat is that that shared folder cannot be the ancestor or the descendant of a folder that was previously shared. And actually, bizarrely, it can't be the ancestor or descendant of a folder that was previously shared, even if it was subsequently unshared. So when you share it, it sets some magic bit in it that you can that you cannot undo, and will prevent you from creating shares at a different level. That's probably a bug. But the basic principle that you can only share one thing in a path from a file to the root of the file system is actually very, very restricting, and leads to all kinds of horrible problems. My daughter, for example, pointed out that in her class in Princeton, the poor humanities professor created a Dropbox share with huge numbers of papers that he had been amassing over the years, and wanted to have a folder in that share for students to submit their assignments, and so put that there as well. But of course was unable to treat that as a different share from the root share, with different privileges, and as a result, of course, the students went, and to make space on their laptops, they deleted all the papers. So there are real consequences to these problems. The final rule that I want to mention, again, I think it's something that's very straightforward and obvious, but I think there's some value to putting a name to it. It's what I call the genericity rule, which says essentially that you should reuse a well-known concept rather than inventing one. So in Keynote, for example, there's this nice ability to structure your slides hierarchically. And if you look at this and you see these little triangles that expand and contract these things, you can see immediately this is a familiar concept. This is essentially the concept of the directory tree. In PowerPoint, however, they didn't do that. They introduced a concept of sections. And then, of course, sections need their own special commands and their own special design. And that just doesn't really help. First of all, you need to get your head around this new concept, and it turns out that concept isn't as well designed as the old concept of the directory tree. It can't be applied recursively, and it has various limitations, and also raises questions about, well, when I create a section, where will it appear, before or after the selected slide, and so on. Oh, I do have one other example. This turns out to be the most important. I'm sorry. Because this will lead me to explaining the implementation platform that I want to talk about. So I call this rule the integrity rule, and it's basically a rule that says that concepts should interact conjunctively, preserving their properties, and that they shouldn't damage each other in combination. So let me give you an example of integrity being violated. So this is a simple example from Gmail. And it's to do with the interaction of two concepts, the concept of a label and the concept of a conversation. So here I have a conversation, and this conversation carries multiple labels, hacking, meetups, and JavaScript. And if I filter on hacking, I will obviously still see that conversation, because that's one of the labels carried by that conversation. If I filter on meetups, I will also see that conversation because it carries that label. If I filter on both hacking and meetups, I get nothing. Out of curiosity, how many people know why that happens? How many people use labels in Gmail? Okay. So it's an interesting phenomenon. The reason this happens is that labels are applied at the message level, and basically are then aggregated over the messages. So if you happen to have a conversation that has some messages that are labeled one way and some labeled another way, then if you have no message that meets the filter criterion, the conversation will not be selected, even if the conversation in aggregate seems to meet that filter. Now you might be wondering, well, when would when would this actually happen, that you have some messages in a conversation with one label and other messages that don't have that label? Well, there's one major case in which that happens, which produces a surprise, which is really not that surprising, but I would argue, and it's not as entertaining as the one I showed you, but I'd argue it's actually more problematic. And that's the following. It's that some of the messages that you send are labeled sent. So if I select the sent messages, I will get, for example, a conversation. If I look inside that conversation, I will see the messages in the conversation with no indication of which are the ones that I sent. Now, of course, you could say, well, you can figure out which, have your name on them. But that undermines the whole point of this label, which was surely to show me the sent messages. So you can't actually see which messages were sent. So how can we explain what I think is a conceptual flaw here? So the way I think about this is that what we want to do is take the composite behavior of the application and interpret it in terms of the underlying concepts. So some action of the composite system happens, and we interpret that by a kind of representation function as actions of one or more concepts. And now the integrity rule says that when you project the behavior of the system using this interpretation, it should preserve the specifications of all of the concepts. So imagine a trace executing. We get some event, and we say, oh, that belongs to concept A. We get another event, that belongs to concept A. This one belongs to concept B. This purple concept belongs to both of them, and so on. And so now we ask the question, are these underlying traces of the two concepts legitimate traces of their concepts? So we could, for example, look at the label concept, and the label concept says that I've got actions like mark and unmark and find, and its operational principle says if you mark a message with a label and then you find that label, you should get that message. And if you don't mark a message with a label and you do a find on that label, you should not get that message. So this is a completely trivial and obvious specification for label, but of course it's violated by this once it's brought together with conversation. So to understand it, we'd have to say, well, first of all, how did messages get the sent label? So we'll say, well, when a message is sent, this is part of the representation function, we're going to regard that as implicitly attaching the label, applying the mark action to the message to attach the label to it. So this works fine. And then when the sent link is clicked on the left, that isn't really a folder. That's doing a find on all the messages which have this label. So far, so good. The problem is we get the wrong messages in the result, that the set of messages that appear includes messages that were never marked. So this is the idea of integrity, that basically you can take the aggregate behavior of the application and project it onto the different concepts. And this led us to wonder, well, could you turn this into reverse? Could you take your concepts and generate the aggregate behavior of the application by fusing together the behavior of the concepts? And that's what this platform, Deja Vu, by my student Santiago does. So his observation was that if you look at many applications, they basically just reuse the same concepts again and again, right? Once you've seen one social media app, you've seen them all, right? And this is, of course, why they're, in some sense, so easy to use. Because every one of them has some kind of post and some kind of comment and some kind of upvoting and maybe a friend or a follower relation, and maybe it has a notification mechanism. And we understand each of these concepts in isolation, and what the applications do is put them together. The problem is that if you actually want to build one of these apps, there is currently no simple way to put these together. You can use libraries, of course, like an authentication library or maybe a commenting library, but typically these libraries are either front-end or back-end things. They don't give you a complete slice through the stack, and there's a lot of work to glue these libraries in. You could also use, for many of these, you can get these features in a content management system, like WordPress or Drupal or something like that. But then you're typically tied down to sort of pre-configured combinations. So Santiago's idea was to say, well, what if we came up with a collection of concept cliches, the concept implementations that can be used in many different contexts, that have full stack implementations all the way from the front end to the back end, and that then can be composed in a very simple way in a kind of a slightly augmented HTML. And that's what deja vu does. And it synchronizes these concepts purely by joining the actions using the reverse of the mechanism that I just showed you. So the architecture is that you have, on the client side, some collection of client-side implementations of the cliches, which as an end-user programmer you don't need to look at. And likewise, on the server side, you have a collection of implementations of those cliches with their data storage and so on. There's a gateway which deals with transactional behavior, and a client-side library that factors out common features of all the clients. And then what you do is you write an application action on top of those underlying cliches. So to give you an example of what this would look like, we mocked up what a little clone of Hacker News might look like. So if you consider Hacker News and you look at it, you'll see, well, you've got authentication. You know, that's a concept we're familiar with. You've got comments. We know about comments. These posts, you might have thought that there should be a kind of post concept here, but it turns out that a post in Hacker News has almost no behavior associated with it at all. It really just has, you know, a title and a link. And so we actually used a different concept from our library that we call property, which just allows you to essentially create a record. And then there's a scoring mechanism that assigns points. In fact, the scoring mechanism is used twice in Hacker News, once for the comments and once for the posts. And so what you do in Deja Vu is you write a little configuration file that says, here are the concept cliches that I intend to use, and in some cases, to use multiple times. So scoring, for example, is used both for scoring posts and scoring comments. And then you write some routes that navigate around the app. And then if you consider, for example, the home page, we regard that essentially as a composite action. And you write some code like this that essentially is like a little bit of HTML-ish stuff that basically puts together the actions from the cliches and configures those actions. So let me show you that in more detail for the action associated with submitting a post. So this has a tag that says we want everything to happen in a transaction here, which means that in this case, the creation of the post and the creation of the score, the initialization of the score associated with that post, are going to be actions from different cliches that get coordinated. So we've put that in a transaction to make sure that they happen together. We generate an ID. We have a special facility for that, because essentially the composition mechanism is that every concept cliche will keep its own view of an object, and all those objects in the different concepts have to be tied together by a common ID. And that ID then gets used in different places in the transaction. And then we set various parameters. So the cliches are configurable. In this case, we're actually just putting a label on the submit button of this object to say that we want it to have the word submit there. And then finally, there are built-in actions. There's a redirect action that will ensure that when you actually click submit, you automatically get redirected. Santiago has built this, and one of the things that we did to assess this was we took the winning projects in our undergraduate software engineering class, and we built a collection of concepts to show that we could implement all those student projects. So these are not big things, but they're not tiny either. They're projects built by 5 students over about 5 weeks. So about 25 person weeks worth of work, and these were all built in Node.js originally. And so we built a collection of concepts and then counted the number of times each concept was used in each of the applications. And we're working on building up this repertoire of applications to show that the same generic base of concepts can serve many applications. The things that we're working on, one of the things, you might have looked at that HTML and thought, oh, that's pretty disgusting. And it's true, you know, we think it's a lot better than having to write JavaScript and backend code and all that kind of stuff, but it would still be nice if there was an easier way to compose these concepts. So my student Barry McNamara is building a WYSIWYG designer that allows you to take actions from different concepts and drop them onto a visual palette and then configure them in a WYSIWYG way. The gateway is actually an intricate and interesting little piece of software. In particular, it not only has to ensure this transactional behavior, but because everything's happening client-side in terms of the coordination, it has to make sure that the client doesn't actually fake a request that wasn't expected. In particular, for example, authentication is achieved by synchronizing an authentication action in the client with the action to be protected. And so you don't want to allow the client to perform the underlying action without its associated authentication. And so that's something that the gateway handles. And we're also doing a lot of work on the platform itself, building libraries of cliches for social applications, social media apps and other things, and also building cliche support, so the writing of one of these cliches is no harder than writing a regular app. So to close, a few thoughts. So one thought is, I've sort of done some thinking to try and figure out where this work fits in to sort of traditional computer science research. And I've come to the conclusion that in some sense it's a bringing together of two fields that I think have been rather disparate. On the one hand, there's the work in the very sort of typified by the Prentice Hall series of sort of classical formal methods, particularly formal specification languages. And that work, which was done by people like Jean-Raymond Abrial, Tony Hoare, Cliff Jones, John Guttag, and so on, that work was really all about trying to find ways to describe software at a high level, to write specifications that would define the behavior of a complex software system. On the other hand, there's been this line of research into trying to understand mental models. And it goes way back to work done by Card and Moran and Newell, and continues through Don Norman's work and so on. And in a sense, what these two different groups were saying was sort of connected but different. The formal methods people were saying, you should think about the behavior of your software system in terms of these high-level notions. And the HCI people were saying, if you want to have a good mental model, then you should design the conceptual model of the system to match it. And the design of that conceptual model should be up front. But to my knowledge, people hadn't recognized that these two things were really two sides of the same coin. And so what I think we could do is sort of bring them together and think about the underlying work in software design as precise characterization of the behavior of a system in order to create this mental model that will bring together users and developers in a unified view. And interestingly enough, both of these lines of work began in about 1974. And I think have both been sort of going their own ways since then. But I think there's an interesting connection between the two. The second point I want to make is, this puts it rather polemically. I'll probably regret being recorded for saying this. But design thinking is this huge success. But as some people have noted, there's not always a lot of thinking in design thinking. And Natasha Jen, who's a pentagram designer, put it most memorably in her in a talk that you can find online, where she essentially claims that the main contribution of design thinking is to contribute profits to 3M in their sale of Post-it notes, which, as you might know, are the sort of key tool for all design thinking, because you have to cover a wall in yellow Post-its. But the way I think about it is, design thinking was this, in many respects, a great movement, and it encouraged people to think about users' needs and to think about larger questions, but it's got this sort of irredeemably empirical nature to it, which I know is very fashionable in our field as well, but frankly I think it's gone too far. It's sort of A/B testing on steroids, right, which is that all you need to do is think of a cool idea, and then you don't need to evaluate it or criticize it or discuss it, you just try it, because after all that's the only thing that matters. The problem is that's a very expensive and painful process, and you end up wasting a lot of time basically implementing or prototyping designs that you should have known would fail. But if you go back a little bit, this idea was already well understood in the field of usability, that people like Don Norman and Bruce Tognazini and Ben Schneiderman, that these people, Jacob Nielsen in particular, who coined this term heuristic evaluation, they realized how important it was to build up a body of knowledge for usability that was expressed in simple rules. That didn't mean those rules were watertight and would always give you a completely objective answer, but those rules would represent a useful body of information so that you wouldn't make egregious errors in the design of a user interface because you could apply those rules. And so in a sense, the way I think about this work is trying to take that idea of usability heuristics beyond the user interface, if you like, further down into the system, to its underlying concepts and further up, in a sense, into the mind of the user. Finally, I think one of the intriguing things about concepts is that they offer an opportunity to take up Christopher Alexander's idea of patterns in a setting which is in fact closer to his original sense. Patterns, of course, have been a huge success because of the wonderful idea of design patterns in code. But Christopher Alexander's patterns are not implementation level patterns. They're patterns in the observable behavior, essentially. They're patterns at the point in which the user comes into contact with the system. And I think concepts give us an opportunity to think about patterns in software at that level. I just wanted to say that I'm coming to the end of writing a book about this, and if you'd like to be notified about a draft of the book, then feel free to give me your name at tinyurl concept project, and we'll also notify you when the Deja Vu platform is ready, which we hope will be in just a couple of weeks, ready for other people to try out. And finally, a plug for my photography book. I've been thinking a lot about the problem of depression and anxiety that we have, which is really rampant at MIT, and I think in not only in the entire tech community, but really worldwide. And I'd be very happy to tell you about that project if you're interested. So on that, I'll close. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Daniel, for a wonderful talk. We have time for some questions. So I'll start with a question from Slido, from Anna Zeng. She asks, in order to achieve a tight coupling between one purpose and one concept, how does one define either a purpose or concept to be unambiguously singular?
Wow. So I think a concept has a kind of coherence to it in a way that we're quite familiar with software design. It should typically have simple actions where each action has a simple non-disjunctive specification. It doesn't do multiple things, it just does one thing. The structure that underlies it should be coherent and compelling. And the operational principle should be something that's readily understandable. Identifying a good purpose is much harder. But I think that's about getting sort of head nods from the users and the people who build the system, say, yes, that makes sense. That is actually an articulation of something we need, which isn't too general, like make the product more attractive to users or increase the market share, nor is it something too specific, like, help you in this bizarre corner situation handle this thing, but is rather something systematic, like, enable consistent formatting of a document. And I will say the formulation of purposes turns out to be very tricky, but I think it's very valuable. And whenever I've tried to figure out the purpose of a concept, it's been quite rewarding. And maybe I don't want to cut off other questions, but had an interesting discussion with a student doing a problem set about this on the purpose of tagging in Facebook. So if anyone's interested about that, we could discuss that. I think it's an interesting question.
Questions from the room?
Hi, Matthew Parkinson from Microsoft Research. So I was really interested if you have thoughts on how this kind of design principle could be applied to programming languages, because I kind of feel the idea of concepts and purposes seems very clean, but then you've got kind of Landon's next 700 separate programming languages, where he's sort of arguing for very few concepts in the language, sort of where you...
Well, I think I'm very intrigued by that question, and my hope is that it would apply, but the purposes would need to be expressed in a much more general and abstract form. And I do think that some of the problems that arise in programming language design happen when you have a concept that doesn't have a clear purpose and that interacts in uncomfortable ways with other concepts. So, for example, the concept of this in JavaScript, which is quite problematic because I don't think anyone really knows what it's for, except in some sense to sort of simulate object-oriented programming and provide a workaround for certain kinds of problems. But I think if you look at, for example, the concept of a closure, it's a very nice, or the concept of a prototype, or the concept of a callback. These are concepts which have very straightforward purposes, which I think are orthogonal to one another. So I think it would be very interesting to apply the ideas there.
Hi. Is there a connection between this and the feature-oriented programming paradigm, which has been around for a while. So I'm just a little curious about that.
Yeah, so I think there are many interesting connections with feature-oriented programming, subject-oriented programming, which has some of the same aspects of the sort of view projections, aspect-oriented programming, because the synchronization mechanism is rather like this CSP-like synchronization of action. So I think there are a lot of connections there. I don't think I have anything very intelligent to say about them, except that most of those have been thought of as program modularity mechanisms rather than ways to align the structure of the program with the structure of the behavior as perceived by the user. And I think that's, if there's a novelty here, I think it's probably that. But I think there's lots of interesting things to be explored there.
All right, I'm going to take another question from Slido. Is the integrity rule the same as orthogonality of concepts?
Yes, I think it is essentially, the integrity rule is about orthogonality of concepts. That's right. And I should say that, it's an attempt to make that precise. And I think that, in fact, when I presented this to a group of people, someone told me that exactly the same idea actually exists in the world of features, of telephony features. Although it's not by any means the standard point of view, there is one point of view that understands feature interaction as about this question of whether or not you achieve conjunctive behavior or not. And so I think it is, in that sense, a fairly standard view, yes.
Thank you for the great talk. So I think a concept as an extreme way to summarize operations is intrinsically ambiguous. And so the way to resolve the ambiguity is basically to evolve the concept. So as designers for us, our job to be active designers, to design new concepts and try to push people to conform them, or just as a passive way to basically learn what people do in common and just a way to summarize what people do. What do you think, like, as a...
Exactly. I mean, I think the first thing that you want to do with a concept is figure out whether or not the concept already exists and try and determine whether you could reuse a pre-existing concept, because that will certainly be better. Not only because you get all the design for free, but you get the misfits as well, right? If you take on the concept of tickets, for example, you're going to use ticketing, well, you immediately know that in the real world there are scalpers, and that's a misfit for ticketing. And so you ask yourself, does transferability of my tickets matter? How am I going to deal with that? And there are all kinds of implementation complexities that also are known for concepts. If you can reuse, that's a good thing. I think the provocative thing this is saying is that when you introduce a concept to your system, you should know why. You should have a reason for it, and that's what the purpose is. And I think people often do that. They imagine that they're introducing all these concepts justified in aggregate, and this suggests that you should be able to justify them each individually, which I think is a more exacting and more painful but more productive criterion.
Right. So my question is a bit irrelevant to the talk, but if you go back to the example of the aspect ratio, there were a couple of numbers to the right. Could you please tell what those numbers meant? Because I saw them; they were quite confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. So those numbers were the number of frames remaining if you chose that particular setting.
Okay, fair enough.
And that's why, and that was to do with this confusion of the aspect ratio with the actual pixel dimensions.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Hi, nice talk. I'd hoped you'd say something about how few design patterns you aim to have. I think there's a core that you're trying to reach at that might be in the dozens, not hundreds, not millions, not ones. Is that a goal? And if not, how can you help prevent all the concepts from further balkanization across different aspects of HCI and requirements?
That's a great question. I do suspect that there is a relatively small number, maybe dozens, as you say. I think that in terms of the platform, one can imagine a need to have many more, because you could have all kinds of different variants. Like if you think about what a social media post looks like, how it's structured and exactly what the details of its behavior are, you might not want to parameterize that for the whole space, but rather allow a kind of marketplace in which there are multiple, many different versions of that people could choose. So I suspect from an implementation point of view, it will be handy to have many variants. But I think you're right, that in terms of the number of actually sort of fundamental underlying concepts, there maybe aren't that many. In the little catalog that I've been working on, there are about 30 of them. They include not only things like this, but also things like the concept of a capability, the concept of out-of-band authentication, the concept of a reservation, the concept of a schedule, this kind of stuff.
Do you think it's a coincidence that there were about 30 Gang of 4 design patterns?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll have to ponder that. Very interesting.
Hi. So the first word that I thought of when I listening to your talk was phenomenology, but to come slightly more to earth. You mentioned Alexander a couple of times, and Doug just talked about the design patterns, and you mentioned that, and Alexandrian patterns. So all of your talk reminded me of the concept of that Alexander of Quan, quality without a name, wholeness, life, the mirror of the self. Does that have anything to do with your idea of concepts and purpose, so that it's not building things out of parts with relationships, but there's this notion of belonging, that the things belong together before you conceive of how they're put together?
Wow, that's a great question. I have to confess that when I was actually last night scanning that page from Christopher Alexander's book to put in the slide, and I was sort of paging again through the timeless way of building. Thank you. I was looking at it and thinking also about his much more recent work, thinking, wow, he's really on a different plane. And he's thinking about deep sensibilities and how reductionist and small-minded my work is in comparison. So I wish I could say, yes, I know how to embrace that. But I think that Alexander really understood something about these larger sensibilities, and I don't know how to get that. And I think you're right, it's very important and is a very interesting research question, whether we can somehow put our finger on those underlying sensibilities. But I think concepts are in some sense, as I've presented them, a much more mundane contribution. But I think it's very inspiring to think about whether or not we could somehow address those larger sensibilities.
One final question.
Okay. I was really particularly intrigued by your statement that formal methods and HCI are kind of tracking, if not the same, similar or overlapping problems. Will your forthcoming book go into detail about further detail about that, and or are there any other resources or things talking about that same kind of subject?
Oh, that's a great question. So my book, in a sense, is I do think of as being on the borderline between sort of formal methods, design, user experience, usability, design thinking, and so on. And what I'm really trying to do is, in some sense, bring some of the aesthetics and the spirit of formal methods to thinking rigorously about these design issues, and to counter the idea that usability can only be thought of in soft terms, that one can actually be a bit more precise about these things. I would certainly not be the first person to have done that. An obvious person who comes to mind is Harold Thimbleby, who for many years has done very interesting things in bringing ideas about, for example, algebraic properties of a user interface and so on. And I'm sure there are others that I can't think of right now. But I think he's probably a good place to start if you're interested in the meeting of those two fields. Harold Thimbleby.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but let's thank Daniel again for a great talk.